can see that you just caught me reading my favorite book. This lecture is going to cover the sociology, politics, and arts of literature, intellectuals in the 1920s. Now, intellectuals came to be greatly because of urban living and cities. So in the census of 1940, it reported that more than half of the American population lived in urban areas. Now, the rise of cities for the first time created a distinct body of intellectuals. For the most part, intellectuals came from prosperous, urbanized, middle-class families, and because of the mobility of city living, they could be indifferent to middle-class opinion and not bound by associations to family or region or class. Now, joining this distinct body of intellectuals were sons of immigrants in large cities. They often had a background in learning European Marxism and Talmudic study is related to Judaism. And most of these immigrant intellectuals were cut off from their families by intellectual tastes, and even more rootless than intellectuals who sprang from the middle-class backgrounds. Now, that's the urbanized side of intellectuals. World War I gave rise to, influenced a different kind of intellectual, but similar to that. World War I, art and literature arose from World War I that represented a break from traditional American values. Before the war, new intellectuals demonstrated they were drawn not to reason, but to emotion, not to stability, but to change. Politically, they were attracted to anarchists and the romantic violence of the international workers of the world. World War I completed a sense of disintegration and made clear to perceptive thinkers that they had misread the progressive era and the long Victorian reign of peace, that violence prowled underneath the surface of harmony and rationality. Thank you.
The intellectuals of the 1920s saw themselves as the movement that would regenerate American society. In actuality, they were probably against more things than they actually supported. They rejected the ideology of the past, arguing that American society had been spoiled by the suppression of Puritanism and its values, the hypocrisy, prudery, and commercialism of the Victorian era in capitalism, and the uninspired progressive movement. The intellectuals despised the middle class, claiming that American culture had become a business culture, where people were bent only on making a living and not leading an interesting life. They rejected the idea of materialism and sought to prevent political corruption. They revolted against the progressive movement, and threw the teachings of progressive reformers such as H.G. Wells, Jane Addams, and Golden Rule Jones out the window and dismissed their politics as orthodox or conformist. They deemed the progressives as a reform movement without souls and lacking in a youthful fervor. A prominent, if not infamous, intellectual author and politician of the 20s was H.L. Mencken. He was a satirist and a social critic who criticized American society through essays and literature and literary works. He advocated prostitution, war, and the expulsion of the public school system. In his later life, he ran for president against Harry S. Truman on the campaign promise to throw the Statue of Liberty into the ocean. He was credited with calling the Civil War a third-rate war, as only 200,000 people were killed.
Oh, hello. You know, in the visual and performing arts of the 1920s, there was an enormous burst of creativity. Alfred Stieglitz is known for introducing the concept of photography as a true art form. He was married to Georgia O'Keeffe, known for her paintings of desert scenes and abstracted flowers. He also ran a gallery that launched the careers of the abstract artist Marsden Hartley and others. John Moran also used abstracted forms, but attempted to depict landscapes. Edward Hopper is famous for his depictions of isolation and dramatic light. Among the performing arts, we see the Provincetown Players, the single most important theater group in modern American theater. They launched the careers of Eugene O'Neill, who introduced a new level of realism to American theater, and Susan Glaspell, known for her realistic depictions of characters' emotions. Elmer Rice was influential among 1920s intellectuals, most particularly for the play The Adding Machine, which depicted the mechanization of industrial labor. Isadora Duncan is known as the creator of modern dance, and she worked during this period. Her dance stylings were improvisational and naturalistic in contrast to the rigid choreography of ballet. During this time, jazz became the underlying current behind most popular music. George Gershwin would later become famous for his use of jazz rhythms and syncopated forms in symphonic music.
Oh, hello. I didn't see you there. You just got me reading my favorite book. I'm going to tell you about F. Scott Fitzgerald. Fitzgerald's life is a tragic example of both sides of the American dream, the joys of young love, wealth, and success, as well as the tragedies associated with excess and failure. One of his most famous books, The Great Gatsby, depicts the golden life that many led during the 1920s. In perhaps his greatest novel, he depicts the dreaming and what people do to rich dreams in the high society of the East through the eyes of Nick, a Westerner. In this, he shows how this affluent society had a hollow core of pretense and emptiness, and how many of the old money were cruel and heartless. His second book, This Side of Paradise, is a somewhat autobiographical novel about the new life of former soldiers who fought in the war against Germany. In these books, Fitzgerald was able to portray both the benefits and problems with high society. The 20s marked the high point in his career, and unlike other authors, later years were not kind to Fitzgerald, as he did not produce any major works after the 20s. Another famous writer of the 1920s was Ernest Hemingway. He was a key figure in World War II and liked to portray soldiers, hunters, and bullfighters in his books, and a lot of them are somewhat autobiographical. One of his most famous books is A Farewell to Arms, which is from the post-World War I era. It is published in 1929, 10 years after the war, and is the story of Lieutenant Henry, who is forced to choose between love and duty in a world of duty and desire. Henry is an ambulance driver who gets in a serious relationship with a nurse and flees to Switzerland. His other book, For Whom the Bell Tolls, is about Robert Jordan, an American fighting in the Spanish Civil War against fascism. It is similar to A Farewell to Arms in the fact that Hemingway did use real-world experiences, as he was in both the Spanish Civil War and World War I. Many agree that For Whom the Bell Tolls is Hemingway's greatest work, and it changed the way that modern literature is written because his simple text was very popular.
And this concludes the lecture about 1920s intellectuals. Thank you for listening.